Hello, this is Yarrow, and welcome to Vested Capital, episode number 18, featuring my guest, Tim Ferriss. Vested Capital is a podcast about how people make money and put their capital to work. I interview startup founders, angel investors, venture capitalists, crypto and stock traders, real estate investors, and leaders in technology. Today, I have a real treat for you. So you probably know Tim Ferriss as the author of the 4 Hour Workweek, the 4 Hour Body, the 4 Hour Chef, a whole bunch of other books on peak performance. He's also the host of his own podcast, which has become absolutely massive in the last sort of 4 or 5 years. He has huge guests on there, mainstream celebrities, athletes, stars, experts. He's known as a biohacker. He has done many experiments on himself to improve his own performance, to maximize the speed of adoption of skills, learning optimization, basically. His books have covered all these topics and many more. He's also a very successful angel investor. Maybe you don't know that, but he was one of the early investors in companies like Uber and Spotify. He's had a TV show. There's so many things I could tell you about Tim, which you probably already know, which is why I'm excited to give you this special Vested Capital episode, which is really just one big, long Tim Ferriss interview. I say it's one big, long one because I've combined all three of the interviews I've done with Tim Ferriss. So a little bit of background, just so you understand where all of this is coming from. So go back all the way to the year 2007. I was brand new to blogging and podcasting. I'd been doing it for about 2 years at that point. It was very early days for both those mediums. And this guy sends me an email. His name is Timothy Ferriss. He says he's written a book called The 4 Hour Workweek, and he'd love to send me a copy. And also, if possible, we could talk about it on my podcast at some point, if I was up for it. Now, I'm a little embarrassed to say that I never actually got back to Tim and said yes to that interview straight away. I lumped that email in with a whole bunch of very similar emails I was getting at the time from authors of books that were just published. It was very common, still is really, for a podcaster to get these requests when a person is releasing a new book. Hey, would you like a copy of the book? And would you interview the author on your show? Now, I was doing that, but because I was kind of getting overwhelmed with those, I would just say no to a lot of them, including Tim. Fast forward a couple of weeks later, and suddenly I'm seeing this book called The 4 Hour Workweek creating a huge craze. All these podcasts and blogs were talking about it. It seemed like it was creating a much bigger impact than a lot of the other books that had sort of been released recently on similar topics. Now, you probably understand why that is. Tim Ferriss wrote The 4 Hour Workweek, released it in 2007, and it really did make a splash. It talked about lifestyle design. It made everyday people who were working 9-to-5 jobs realize that it's possible that they could have a much more designed lifestyle, including travel, exploring their hobbies and passions, learning new skills, without needing to be rich and without needing to wait for retirement. So Tim really flipped the script, opened their eyes to the potential of things like creating a side income stream, creating an online business, which allows you to travel. He called it a muse at the time. And so many entrepreneurs over the years following will go back and say one of their initial inspirations for either quitting their job or becoming an entrepreneur for the first time was because of this book, The 4 Hour Workweek. So going back to my story in 2007, although I initially rejected Tim, as I saw this book balloon in popularity in the next couple of weeks, I did write back to him and said, hey, I'd love a copy of the book. And yes, let's book you in for the show. Tim, of course, was an unknown quantity at the time. He hadn't done any of the things publicly. By then, he had already done a lot of cool things behind the scenes. He traveled the world. He'd built his own supplements business. He'd become like a tango world champion, been in mixed martial arts movies, crazy behind the scenes stuff that really was the reason I believe the 4 Hour Workweek stood out, not just for the idea it presented, but all the amazing things Tim had lived through, which was kind of like the example, the proof of his concept. So I got Tim on. I read his book. For me, the book wasn't eye-opening because I was kind of in the same boat as him. I didn't want a job and I'd managed to make my own income stream. But I was very fascinated by the things he'd done with his travels and just how much this book was really going mainstream. I was, to be honest, a little bit jealous. I wish I had written the book and I had gotten it out there, but full credit to Tim. He was the one who went out there and did it. And he came onto the show being a little green, to be absolutely honest. He was doing a lot of interviews for that book, but I think it was possibly the first time he was really going mainstream with his personal brand. So he was talking a lot of podcasts, radio shows, getting a lot of blog interviews. Now, I was also very green at the time. I'd only been doing my podcast for maybe a year and a half, very ad hoc. I hadn't really done very many interviews. So I actually interviewed Tim, and it's an interview I'm including today as the third and final part of this episode of Vested Capital. So I've got 3 interviews with Tim. The third one is the very first interview between myself and Tim from 2007 about the 4 Hour Workweek. It is a little green, but I want to include it because it's a nice nostalgia trip. And Tim does still do a great job of introducing this idea of the 4 Hour Workweek and how it all came about, and talks about some of his travels and experiences and what it's like to create a muse, a side income stream, and all that. So that is included in this episode from 2007. Now, fast forward to 2012, Tim is releasing his third book, The 4 Hour Chef, which is all about learning optimization, how to master skills in a shorter period of time, which is something Tim had been practicing. And he'd been doing it through cooking, but also language learning. And he was releasing this new book to share those stories. He's very much a hacker, a biohacker, a human performance hacker. So he was still experimenting on himself. And of course, when he releases a new book, he always tries to get on as many podcasts and blogs as possible. So he came back to me to be one of many bloggers and many podcasters to write about this new book, which I, of course, said yes to. But I was a little bit cheeky. I also said to Tim, and I'll be honest, there's no way this would work today. He's way too popular and busy and, says no to most things. But back then, I could still get Tim to say yes to certain things like this. I said, I'd love to interview you about the 4 Hour Chef and release it publicly on my podcast for the right timing to help you sell more books, which was his goal. But I said, I'd also appreciate it if you could do a second interview with me, something behind the scenes specifically for my members. I had a membership site back then. I still do. It has a different name today. It's called the Laptop Lifestyle Academy. Back then it was called the EJ Insider. Doesn't really matter. It was just something I was very much focused on at the time. And I wanted to give something special to my members, an interview with Tim Ferriss, but not talking about his books. I wanted to learn about Tim before he became the famous author. And of course, today, the famous podcaster, the famous angel investor, the famous peak performance expert, just the famous person really, and learn in more detail how he was able to travel the world. What was his first success with business, all those sorts of things. So I ended up doing 2 interviews with Tim, one on the 4 Hour Chef and his formula for peak performance through mastering the speed of learning. So basically getting faster at learning new skills. And then the second interview only for my members, which was about his prior history before he wrote the 4 Hour Workweek, what he did at university, what he did growing up, and so on. So we did those 2 interviews. One went public, which is on the feed for this podcast, and one was private only for my members. So for the very first time today in this episode of Vested Capital, I am releasing publicly that behind the scenes interview with Tim. And I think it's also probably the best one I've done with Tim, because frankly, by then I was more comfortable interviewing people, and it was a story style interview. It wasn't specifically about one book. It was more about Tim's early history, which was certainly my sweet spot, my comfort zone with my podcasting. So in summary, you are about to hear 3 interviews with Tim Ferriss, starting with his background story. The first interview I did that was not released publicly, so this is brand new. No one has heard this besides my members. Followed by my 2012 4 Hour Chef interview, all about how Tim learns skills quickly, and he teaches you his techniques and systems for that. And then finally, the original 2007 4 Hour Workweek interview, when Tim and I were both young and green to the world of podcasting and doing interviews and being interviewed. And we talk about his first ever book that put him on the map, the 4 Hour Workweek. Okay, that is it. I hope you enjoy all 3 of these interviews. I'm so excited to release them, especially the one that I haven't released publicly before. As a result, this is a longer than average podcast, well over an hour and a half. I think you'll love it, though. There's a lot of Tim Ferriss wisdom in this episode. And yeah, I'm just happy to share with you this trifecta of Timothy Ferriss interviews. Here we go. Nowadays, Tim, we hear about your success, which is building on your prior success, which is building on your prior success. We don't really know much about your background. So thank you for taking the time to hopefully dish all the mysteries about your sordid past.
My pleasure. Many mysteries to follow. Yes. So Tim does have a bit of a deadline to meet, so we're going to try and get into this straight away. No chit chat. Tim, I am curious, where were you born and raised?
I was born at the very east end of Long Island, so out by Montauk, and grew up in a middle-class family. My parents were involved in real estate and physical therapy, never made more than $50K a year combined, and grew up in a resort town, effectively. I mean, out by the Hamptons. So my first jobs were working in ice cream stands and restaurants as busboy, and occasionally got upgraded to waiter if they were short on staff. But that really was the upbringing. Went to elementary school, high school, at least the first half on Long Island, and then transferred to New Hampshire to boarding school, which was actually my idea because one of my friends, only one, had been forced to go to boarding school by his parents and thought it was the best decision they had ever made for him. And it ended up being true for me as well. That took me to New Hampshire. After that, after a year in Japan also, which was very formative, ended up at Princeton. And then after Princeton, ended up in Silicon Valley. Of course, there's a lot that I'm jumping over in the details.
I am curious, is there any entrepreneurial endeavors in that period of your life?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I became fascinated. I've always had insomnia as long as I can remember and as long as my mom can remember. So I would stay up and I would see Tony Robbins and Ron Popeil and all of these infomercials just by virtue of being up as late as I was. And I became really fascinated by the art of the pitch, so to speak, and offers, deal structure, and so on and so forth. So even before I could actually buy products, I, unbeknownst to my parents, would sometimes call these phone numbers just to see what questions they asked me and how they kind of led me through the process. And in college, I really began to take it more seriously. My junior year, I decided to create my own information product, which was called, and this is a terrible title, How I Beat the Ivy League. It was a guide to getting into top tier schools with subpar SATs, for instance, in my case. I thought it would sell itself, decided I would sell to guidance counselors through their newsletters and whatnot. And it sold a grand total of 2 copies. I took all of my savings and put it into inventory for the minimal run that I could do, which was a few hundred cassettes, and sold 2 copies, one to my mom and one to some unknown that I don't remember at this point in time. And I actually only threw those tapes away a few years ago. I was convinced, someday I would be vindicated and the brilliance of this product would be shown to the world at large. But
I can't believe you threw them away. They could be a collector's item on eBay.
Well, I kept a few, but listening to it, number one, it was actually pretty terrible. But number two is I decided on a product first and then tried to find people to sell it to. That was a big mistake. That's something that continues to be a mistake that I attempt to fix, not only for myself, but for startups that I work with. But flash forward a year, my senior year in school, I decided to focus on low-cost testing and also finding the market first and then designing the product. So I decided to create a 3-hour accelerated learning course with a focus on increasing reading speed and offered it to Princeton students for $50 for a 3-hour seminar with, I think it was a 200% money back guarantee if you don't triple your reading speed, something along those lines. And didn't have any money. I was working for $8 an hour in a library at the time and then bouncing at night for additional income. And I sold the entire thing out. It was, I guess, 32. I also got very good at phone sales as a result of spending all this time looking at infomercials and reading copy from Caples and whatnot.
Can you timestamp this? Because you're in university.
This was in 1999, 2000. So 1999, probably.
So are you still selling cassettes? I don't think so, right?
Oh, no, that was over and done with. I had thrown in the towel for the most part, and I was only focused on doing the seminar, and it was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. And I just remember getting on my bike after the event and riding immediately to the bank to deposit all this money, which was $1,500 or whatever. And I was just bunched up in my hands and in my pockets as checks and $20 bills. And I've never felt richer in my entire life. I mean, even now, like that day was a real aha moment where I was like, okay, this stuff can work. It's not all bullshit, because I started to doubt all the get rich quick stuff. And I still think most of it is not terribly helpful, but it did show me that if you focus on low cost testing, I mean, I had to beg a church to let me use their daycare center on an off hours day to teach using their space. And it was just the cost of my time and obviously developing the course and then putting up a couple of flyers here and there at school, that as long as you control the downside, the upside is eventually pretty much guaranteed, if that makes sense. If you can cap your downside, the upside more or less takes care of itself, as long as you're a rational person who learns from your mistakes and ideally from the mistakes of other people.
So don't go and produce hundreds of cassettes before you have a market.
No, go to, unbounce.com or something like that, create a landing page and test to ensure that people are willing to pay for what you are actually trying or thinking of trying to sell before you ever manufacture.
Okay, so how old are you when you have this first success with the seminar on speed reading?
I guess I was 22, along those lines.
So you're basically a university college student. And what were you studying?
I was studying neuroscience and then linguistics, but specifically East Asian languages like Japanese, Chinese, and Korean.
Why?
Because I found it interesting. I think liberal arts, the goal of liberal arts is to create well-rounded problem solvers who are curious. I don't think that the job of liberal arts education is to prepare you for trade. That's why you would go to a specific professional school. I studied what interested me, and in the end, it ended up with all this writing stuff. We won't jump to that, but kind of came full circle, and now I can actually use that stuff. So,
ironically, but what were you thinking at the time in terms of what's my future going to be? A career, big business? I mean, you're talking Silicon Valley as well, so you must be thinking startups.
Yeah, well, I didn't know at that point. All of my classmates were competing for investment banking or management consulting, and I didn't want to do either of those things. So I actually took a year off of school, senior year, and worked for various companies in different industries of different sizes. I decided that the size was potentially the most important to me. So I worked for a political asylum research firm, which helps people apply for political asylum in the US. That was a 3-person company. But I also worked for companies as large as Berlitz International, which was 10,000 people redesigning their Japanese and English curriculum. And at the end of it all, I decided that I wanted to work for a company that was somewhere between 10 and 50 people. That led me to consider different startups. So ultimately ended up deciding to move to Silicon Valley, but it wasn't easy. I actually I did my final paper in a class called High Tech Entrepreneurship. It was ELE 491 on a company called TrueSand Networks. And it was a profile of the company. And at the end, I what I thought, tactfully asked them for a job or to at least give me a shot. And they said no. And the CEO proceeded to say no 32 times. I'm not kidding. I saved the emails until I finally said, and I was already graduated. I was at home now. My parents were like, you can get a job any day now. Feel free. And I sent an email and I said, I'm going to be in San Jose, which is where the company is located anyway, next week. It would be great to meet up just to say thank you for your time and give you some competitive analysis that didn't make it into the paper, which might be helpful for you guys. And said, no, sorry, I can't do it. And then had a change of heart about an hour later. And he said, all right, I can meet you from, I think it was something like 1:15 to 1:30 on Tuesday. And the truth of the matter was I didn't have a ticket. So then I had to take my savings and buy a standby ticket, fly to San Francisco. I stayed in San Francisco, but went to San Jose and didn't have enough money for a hotel. So I stayed at a kickboxing gym and lived on the second floor on a bunk bed for the period of time that I was there. And ultimately, he made me wait around for a couple of hours and met with other people in the company. And he said, okay, you're just not going to stop bothering me until I say yes. Is that right? And I said, I suppose that's about right. And he said, great, you're in sales. And so he put me into outside sales. So my job was to sell multi-million-dollar data storage systems to people like DreamWorks or American Airlines or the FBI or National Geological Survey, people like this.
So you became a wage slave.
I became a wage slave, but there was a big commission component. So that's really when I started studying negotiation and sales again as a focus and bought everything you can imagine. Spin selling, getting past no, secrets of power negotiating, like you name the book, I read it. Over time, developed an approach that seemed to work pretty well. And that included not making phone calls for the entire day because I noticed that if you called during 9 to 5 hours, you almost always got secretaries and gatekeepers, and you'd fail 9 times out of 10 to get a decision maker on the phone. So I would actually come in early and make phone calls from say 7 to 8:30. And then I would do other types of work like prospecting and research, and then make phone calls again after 6 p.m. And taking that approach, I closed a lot more meetings, and as a result, closed a lot more sales.
Interesting. So did this eventually turn into your own startup or something like your own business, or did you actually stay in employment for a while?
I was employed for about a year and a half. I'd have to go back and look at the exact dates, but the company was, as many tech startups at the time, promising more than it could deliver. And engineering was behind and eventually started running out of money because they couldn't ship product. They could book revenue, but they couldn't receive revenue. And they started firing divisions. And I saw the painting on the wall. So I decided that I could run aspects of the business better than the people currently running it, and started to fantasize about starting my own thing. And I asked a very simple question, which I still ask, which was, what do I spend a disproportionate amount of my income on? And the answer was sports nutrition. And I had a little bit of background in the sciences in undergrad when I actually made different types of performance enhancing supplements for myself. My bedroom looked like a meth lab, which I don't recommend. But the upshot of it was I realized that not only did I spend a ridiculous amount of money on sports supplements, in some cases, $250, $400 a month, when I was making a base salary of $40,000 pre-tax, my friends did the same. And many of them made even less than I did.
What were you doing? Were you trying to be an Olympian or?
Yeah, well, I was a competitive athlete for many, many years, and I was an All-American in wrestling in high school. So I took athletic performance very, very seriously. But there are literally millions of guys who have that same purchasing behavior. And I decided, as I often do, that I would just make the product that I wanted and sell it to people who are like me. It made it surprisingly easy to target. I was like, okay, well, I train in kickboxing, I train in this, and I value reaction speed. So let me find contract biochemists whom I can pay per hour or per document to help me formulate a product that will improve reaction speed, and then let me market to specifically trade publications for, let's say, kickboxing or martial arts, powerlifting, because it's a very clearly defined niche, and therefore it is both easier to plan your media strategy or acquisition strategy. It's also cheaper because you're very precise. Like saying everyone is your customer is the worst thing I could possibly hear as, let's say, an advisor or a potential investor. That reeks to me of wasting money, which is almost always the case.
Okay, so you actually went as far as having some research done for your product, which is quite daunting, I think, for most people. They would just think, I'll write an ebook or I'll purchase something wholesale. But you were thinking, no, I'm going to put together a specific supplement that I want to use using some science to figure it out.
Yep, that's right. And it turns out that almost all sports nutrition or vitamin companies outsource nearly every function of their business. As a result, though, they're very secretive about who they use, even though, for instance, even in mountain bikes, I mean, the top mountain bike brands are almost all made in the top 2 or 3 manufacturing facilities. But I started calling people who were tangentially related to supplements during my lunch breaks when I was still working as a wage slave. And I was like, all right, well, if no one who's actually running supplement companies is going to answer my questions, let me do searches for vitamin supplement, contract, packaging, labeling, etc. And then I used the same approach, calling before hours and after hours, and eventually got the president of a company called Marical, which does a lot of packaging, on the phone. And he answered. I mean, it's a big company, and he answered the phones at 7 o'clock whenever I called. And I told him, I just said, you don't know me. This is totally out of left field. I'm just starting out in this. I want to use you for my business. I'm not a joker. Like, here's a few of the things that I've done. And I just really need your help. I want to spend money. I don't know who to call. And he was great. I basically pulled at some point, I'm sure you called somebody like I'm calling you. So like 5 minutes would really mean the world to me. If you hang up, I understand, but it would really, really mean the world to me. And he ended up spending more than an hour on the phone with me and made all the introductions I needed to get this product put together. It was just fantastic. And I was off to the races at that point, although I needed money to do the manufacturing run. So I basically browbeated and guilted all my friends in the company into agreeing to pre-order the product so I could pay for my first manufacturing run.
Okay, so what was this product, Tim? We're talking about a pill you pop or what?
Yeah, it's a pill. So it's called Body Quick or Cogdamine, and it ended up being sold in about 12 countries when it was at its height. It's still sold today, even though I sold the company in 2009. The product has more than a dozen ingredients that affect primarily three mechanisms of action. One is increasing microcirculation in the brain, so oxygen uptake and glucose metabolism. That would be vinpocetine or vinpocetine, vinca minor, things like that. Then you have ingredients that are precursors to acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter utilized for muscular contraction, among other things. Thirdly, would be cofactors that help in conversion of these different constituent pieces into substrates that can be used by the body.
Okay.
So all of this means, and the mechanism, which is primarily acetylcholine focused, is actually rumored to be what a lot of the top Jamaican sprinters are using right now for one of their competitive advantages. But that was it. Pre-workout, reaction speed based supplement.
Right. And that's perhaps a little bit above and beyond what most people go and do for their first, well, it wasn't your first business, but I guess your first sort of startup.
But let me add one thing, because it isn't. It just seems like there would be no market, because it's like athletes that are interested in faster reaction speed, like baseball hitters, tennis players, etc., boxers, and a lot of celebrity athletes ended up using it. But the finer your niche, the more you will cap your losses, like controlling that downside, because you will be very targeted in your messaging and your marketing and your media. And I would just say that you can always expand your market later, but you should not start off broad and then have to niche down later, because you'll waste a lot of money and time.
I think what I'm referring to is even just the manufacturing process of putting together what I view as a somewhat complex product. I think perhaps at the time for you, it didn't seem too complex because you had knowledge in that area. But, for a guy who's been writing content, that was a very scientific explanation you just gave for a product. So
sure. Yeah. I mean, and I did have background. I did have a little bit of background, but, putting together that product, it's not rocket surgery, as they say, but it's definitely more complex than what I would do, what I would recommend to someone. Physical products and physical fulfillment is a pain in the ass. It's really the biggest headache imaginable. So information is certainly much more interesting to me these days.
Now, I'm curious because I think everyone who's read the 4 Hour Workweek knows that your supplements business was your initial muse, as you call it, the initial income stream for your travels. Everything you've done that everyone wanted to replicate, your ability to hop on planes and have these short mini vacations. And it was the business that I'm assuming you systematized, so it became a fairly automated income stream too. So I'm correct in all of that, right?
Yep, that's true.
Can you tell us then, I would like to spend a bit of time on how this business grew to the point where it allowed you to have all this freedom? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I started very targeted and focused on print in niche magazines, which was effective. And the messaging was very similar to the speed reading. I offered 110% money back guarantee, guaranteed to see effects in the first 60 minutes of your first dose, which was true, and then pushed to either a call center or the web. Later on, when I got a little smarter about it and decided to involve distributors because I hated fulfillment, I would go to someone like bodybuilding.com. They're amazing. They're a huge company. People don't realize they do hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue per year. I would come to them after having negotiated, say, a full page print ad from $20,000 to $2,500. And the two resources I used for that primarily were Secrets of Power Negotiating by Dawson and Getting Past No. So I would negotiate that down. Then I would go to someone like a bodybuilding.com and I'd say, hey, I have a full page ad valued at $20,000. If you are willing to order just half of that in wholesale, so spend $10,000 on product and pre-order that, I will put your phone number and URL exclusively in this print ad. And that way I was guaranteed not to lose money on that advertisement. Even though I might sacrifice some of the upside, I was guaranteed not to lose money. And I just tried to scale that as quickly and as widely as possible. And I did that in the US, I did that in the UK, I did that in Australia, I did it all over the place, is finding big companies to effectively sponsor the advertising by buying product in advance in return for their placement in the advertising. This is very commonly done for retail. That's where I picked it up, where you'll see, or even for infomercials, if you see 90-second spots for like Hydroxycut, what do you see? You see logos for Rite Aid, Walgreens, etc. It's the same exact process.
Interesting. So it's sort of like a cross promotion in exchange for bearing some of the cost.
Bearing all of the cost.
All the cost, right. That sounds like even like a jump from just selling it to your buddies at work to
well,
going.
I was selling it to my, I was selling it to my buddies at work, but I was simultaneously putting together a very simple website that then processed payments through authorize.net and whatnot. I mean, it was very primitive back in 2001. But at that time, I would get orders and I would print out the mailing labels and I would collect them all up at the end of the day and take them to the post office and mail them off priority mail myself. And that got old really fast. So eventually started hiring fulfillment centers and first local fulfillment centers, eventually a large fulfillment center in Tennessee because the UPS shipping was cheapest from the center of the country and also fastest in both directions, east and west. But a lot of that was, of course, the infrastructure that I was building. And many of these companies I met just by going to a select handful of industry trade shows, which I recommend everyone do before they start a company. If you're thinking of starting a company in, let's say, the food or beverage industry in some fashion, could be a sports drink, could be some type of canned good, anything, you should go to the fancy food show and so forth and so on and really see who the players are. And you can find every contract supplier, manufacturer, packager, fulfillment company you can imagine by going to one show. So, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. Spend the $50 or $200 necessary to go to one of these things and fly there so you meet these people in person.
Okay, so how did this grow from something that you were doing, I assume, on the side at your job, and then I'm assuming, quit your job, and then you're managing?
I did not quit. The inside sales division was fired. And as soon as they were fired, I knew that the outside division, which I was part of, was next. And at that point, I really had not launched the product. I had not started selling it at that point. I had only gathered pre-orders from my buddies to help pay for the first manufacturing. Right. So as soon as that happened, I was on severance pay for maybe 2 months or 3 months. I have no idea. And had my health insurance paid for through Cobra in the US, because our healthcare is a mess, as you know, for something like 6 months. And I was like, all right, well, I need to start generating some real money in the next 3 to 6 months or I'm in trouble. And that's when I started doing it full time. So it was full time pretty much from the outset.
So it sounds to me like the secret here, a lot of it was your very keen selling / negotiating skills in terms of getting deals for marketing and no doubt getting deals for shipping and fulfillment and so on. Can you take us through how it went from this startup to, I'm assuming, something that required very little of your time so that you could jet off to Japan or do all the things you did do, and maybe even take us to the point you'd start traveling, or I don't know when the mini vacations began, but I'm assuming they started soon.
They started in mid-2004. So from 2000 to mid-2004, there were no mini vacations of any type. Mid-2004, my long-term girlfriend at the time, whom I had assumed I was going to marry, broke up with me because I was working from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., so I can't really blame her. I basically chased the time zones. I would wake up, talk to people in Asia, then Australia, and just work my way all the way to California, then Hawaii, and it was horrible. But at that point, I really realized that the income I was making, and I was doing extremely well. I mean, I'd been making 40 base salary, like I mentioned before, and I was pulling in more than 40K a month at that point, and I was totally miserable. I mean, I was trapped in this machine of my own making. So I made the decision that I would go to London for 4 weeks to pull myself out of my routine and also to stop having meetings and phone calls and whatnot, and attempt to redesign the business so it could run without me. And if I was not successful, then I would shut the business down because clearly it wasn't working. I mean, my quality of life was not improving along with my income. What I did, it's really almost embarrassing to admit how simple this was, but I sent an email to all of my contracted fulfillment centers, manufacturers, et cetera, all these third parties, and said to the managers, my points of contact, I said, I am no longer your customer. My customers are your customer. I'm going to be extremely hard to reach. Therefore, if anything costs $100 or less to fix, just fix it yourself, make the customer happy. and then log it in an Excel sheet, and I'll review those on a weekly basis. I'll review the decisions. And it worked so well because prior to that, I would get contacted for everything that was outside of the norm. So it's like, oh, such and such an athlete needs bottles overnighted to Austria for a skiing competition. What should we charge? What should we do? And that was chewing up, 40, 50 hours a week. And I'm not kidding. It dropped to less than 5 hours a week just with that one email. Over the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and so on, I kept on upping the ante. So went to $200. If it's $200 or less, go ahead and fix it. $500 less, go ahead and fix it. And when I got to the end of 4 weeks, I'd been successful at pulling myself out of 90% of all the day-to-day business stuff. And it was at that point I had also pretty much perfected the art of not doing advertising for direct acquisition of customers, although I was also using Google AdWords, but I was using companies like bodybuilding.com to handle all the fulfillment and all the order taking. So I was effectively only managing the ad placement and then the negotiation of how much inventory they would buy. And then they would wire the funds and everyone was happy. That's when I extended my trip. And the 4 weeks turned into 18 months. And then here we are.
So that was a bit of a crash course in how to, not systematize your business, but certainly take away a lot of the labor and make the decision-making go to someone else. Now, were you a one-person show still at that stage, Tim?
Yep, one-person show. I was a one-person show pretty much the entire time. I mean, I had virtual assistants who would help with very specific projects, but I did not have an assistant that I would hot potato things to. I had many different people who would do analytics and website design and so forth from India, Ukraine, or wherever, using Elance and other services. But I did not have a company structure with multiple people. That I did not have.
Mm-hmm. At this point in time, did you start traveling a lot? Is this when you kicked in all your goals to, win dancing competitions and get into Hong Kong films and all the things you talk about in your books?
Yeah, that's when I got started. And I mean, it was not easy because all I had done was work up to that point for the last 4 or 5 years. And, I remember the first week or two in the UK where without work, I did not know how to fill my time. So I was in this vague daze wandering around London, going from like tourist attraction to museum to tourist attraction, trying to avoid the internet cafes. And it took a while to resurrect these interests that I'd had in college and high school and to really regain that curiosity. But that rough reentry period was really obviously necessary and definitely worth it. I mean, I wouldn't be here without it. So I think that anyone who's trying to completely redesign their business to support lifestyle design should expect that there are going to be some growing pains.
Mm-hmm. All right. So where are we at? You said 4 or 5 years of doing this. So you must have been hitting your mid-20s by now, mid to late 20s?
Yep, that's right. Mid to late 20s. So that was 2004, 2005, 7 years ago. It put us at 28.
Okay. So in summary, I don't want to review the entire process, but next, you just traveled like crazy, right? So can you give us a summary of, I went to Japan and learned this, and I went to here and learned this over the next, because I'm assuming the business starts running itself reasonably well, and you're just indulging in these experiences.
Yeah, I checked email, once a week just to get pretty much to play matchmaker with media buys and inventory purchases, and then making sure money was going to my bank account. That was pretty much it. I mean, I did have one catastrophic emergency, which was in hindsight pretty not funny, I mean tragic, but really awful, where I was in Bratislava and I checked my Skype voicemail, I think it was at the time, and the president of my fulfillment company had a heart attack and died. He was a very heavy guy, and they wwere shutting everything down in 48 hours. They said, you have 48 hours to get all of your inventory out of our warehouses or we're just going to leave it on the sidewalk. And I'm in the Slovak Republic. And I did sort that out, but it was a bit of a headache. So first I was in London and I had no plans because I'd lived my entire life in 15-minute Outlook increments, right? And I wanted to be completely unstructured. So the way that I traveled was following where the wind took me. And if I found 2 or 3 people who said, you need to go here, I would go there. So I went from London to Galway in Ireland, where I learned hurling, which is one of the most amazing sports in the world. It's the fastest field sport in the world. From there, jumped back over to Europe, traveled all throughout Europe, and ended up landing in Germany, in Berlin, which I fell in love with. And I stayed there for 3 months and studied MMA meaning mixed martial arts, German, and also looked at graffiti and electronic music, which was a blast. Berlin is a lot of fun. After that, I went home very briefly for Christmas. And very briefly is important because I was trying to get a tax exemption for spending the vast majority of my time overseas. I think it's 330 days and 365-day period or something like that. Talk to your accountants. But very short trip back to the US. And then I went to Panama, and I spent a month in Panama. And a couple of friends said, you have to go to Argentina. So I planned on a 4-week trip to Argentina. And that ended up being 9 months because I was bitten by the tango bug and then started training like a maniac, 6 to 8 hours a day, and went to the world championships and set a world record and all this craziness. And then after that, I came back to the US.
There was more traveling, Tim. I know there was more traveling.
Well, there was more traveling. I just didn't talk about all of the little countries in between. But
Okay.
yeah, I hit a lot of places.
So first of all, how did you solve the fulfillment issue with the guy with the heart attack?
I had to scramble and have some of my outsourcers also help to find a replacement fulfillment center, and then have all of the materials shipped to that new fulfillment center. So that's how I resolved it.
Wow.
Is the short answer.
Okay.
Yeah. But it wasn't, here's the thing. That sounds like a huge disaster. And in some ways it was stressful, but it didn't take more than 2 afternoons to fix. And to have the type of lifestyle that you really want and to do the really big, good things, you have to let transient bad things like that happen. If you want to predict all of those problems from happening, that means you have to have your hands in every aspect of every facet of your business. And that means you have no life. So I view it as very zero sum. It's one or the other. So getting comfortable with letting that kind of temporarily painful stuff happen and accepting that that's just the price you pay for being a 30,000 foot view strategic thinker is very important.
Mm-hmm. Now you eventually sold this business. So can you take us through that decision-making process, and when did that happen?
That happened in 2009. I sold it in 2009, and it was actually, funny enough, it was bought by one of the guys in a group of investors I had met while I was traveling. And they couldn't BS me because when I told them, this thing is a cash cow and it takes no time to run, they'd seen me when we would go to internet cafes together and work. And I'd be like, okay, guys, I'm done. I'll see you outside. They'd seen it firsthand. So I ended up selling that in 2009. And you have to get good at deal making for any of this stuff to work. You have to get good at negotiating and creatively structuring deals so both sides win. So for instance, the company sale almost didn't happen because at the time, 2008, financial collapse, the British pound at one point ended up tanking, and the entire transaction was being funded in British pounds because these investors were overseas. All of a sudden, the deal was something like 30% more expensive to them. They're like, sorry, we can't do this. And what I did is ended up doing something along the lines of having them pay 50% of the price and then having something like a 6-month promissory note that they could pay back at X point in time. But if the strike price, meaning the currency rate between the US dollar and the pound recovered, that it would automatically trigger repayment within 14 days or something like that, or payment within 14 days for that final 50%. And that was that. They agreed to it. The deal happened.
Did that deal set you up financially for the rest of your life, sort of thing? Because I know when you started doing the 4 Hour Workweek and became an author and led the life that most people know about. You became a much more public figure. So
yeah, it gave me, I've never been a big spender. So I saved a lot of my cash. It gave me a good chunk of change, but not enough to live on for the rest of my life, but plenty to keep me afloat for many years. And one other thing I should point out is that I actually gave them a great deal on the company. And here's why. Because typically when you sell a company, there are all sorts of reps and warranties, representations and warranties and guarantees of all sorts of types, so that you're a consultant, let's say, to the company for 1 or 2 years. Maybe there's an earnout if you're in startups for equity. And there are all of these catches, in other words, in the fine print where you have to still be involved with the company for an extended period of time. And I didn't want that. So as part of the negotiation, those were all in there. And I said, look, unfortunately, I got to know these guys over time. So it was also a very personal deal. But I said, look, I'm going to give you a great deal because I don't want to deal with these reps and warranties. You know, from having a lot of wine with me, that I do not want anything more to do with this business. It's boring to me. I'm done with it. So I will give you 20% off if you get rid of these reps and warranties. You've already seen how the company runs. You've seen all the internal documents and everything else. And this is good for you. You know it's going to work. And it also allows me to walk away and sort of wash my hands of this. And they agreed. And that was that.
All right, Tim, in the last sort of 5 minutes before you have to run off, can we just sort of in summary, for the people listening who they haven't had their home run startup yet, or not even startup, their home run lifestyle business, they're looking to get the cash flow source, the muse. Mm-hmm. In your experience, especially looking back over that time frame, were there any major things you did right or things you did wrong that you would like to reference to people now for them doing this journey, at the starting phase for them?
Yeah, I would recommend a couple of resources that really helped me too. So the 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. Get the old version, not the internet version, but the 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing by Reese and Trout is outstanding. Secrets of Power Negotiating by Dawson, if you can get the audio, is also incredibly good. And what first will teach you, among other things, is number one, you find the market and then design the product. This is very important, not the other way around. Test inexpensively, and then it's easier to create a category than to dominate an existing category. So BodyQuick, for instance, was a neural accelerator. It's a pre-workout neural accelerator. That is a category that I created, at least as far as I know. And it made it very easy to differentiate the product and to be slotted into a different place in people's minds so that you weren't being price compared. The other things I would recommend are really in the details, but from the very outset, there's actually another book that's quite good called Built to Sell by John Warrillow. And that is thinking about selling your company from the very beginning and designing your company that way. And even if you don't sell it, it's the right way to build a company because it requires you to put in systems that replace you. Because if you're required to run your business, generally speaking, people don't want to buy your business because it means that if you quit or get sick or whatever, the company fails. So Built to Sell is another recommendation. But I would say be different, not just better. Focus on market first. Finding your market, ideally one you belong to, and then designing a product accordingly. And what really saved me as well, and this is why I recommend to most people that they focus on higher margin products, is 8 to 10x margin. In other words, if it costs you $1 to produce, you should be selling it for $8 to $10. If it costs you $10 to produce, $80 or $100 or even more. And it's extremely important, I think, to take that approach, because you will make mistakes in the beginning. You will buy media that doesn't work. You will try partnerships that fail. And that is your safety net, that margin. Those would be a few things that I think I took from that experience in broad sweeps. Also, the most important marketing piece you may ever read is 1,000 True Fans by Kevin Kelly. Again, talking about being very specific with your targeting, which makes you smarter, faster, more agile, and makes everything less expensive. It's free online, 1,000 True Fans by Kevin Kelly.
Yes, I've been recommending that one too, as well as Seth Godin's Tribes to sort of go with it as a companion piece. So great, Tim. Now, most of what you just said was very much physical product orientated, and I'm assuming you have no problems recommending that still today. I know you consult for a lot of Silicon Valley, more software as a service style startups, correct, nowadays?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm.
So do you have a business model you think is the best for right now?
No, I really don't, because I think it's a very personal question. It's kind of like asking, which sport do you think people would be most successful in? And I'm like, well, if you're really tall, go to basketball. If you're really, really short and really strong, maybe you should try powerlifting. I do think it's extremely personal, but I always wanted subscription models, but I've personally shied away from it because I'm extremely lazy when it comes to managing different communities and constantly producing content, believe it or not. Really lazy. I've tried it before. I actually tried a paid forum, like $10 a month, very cheap. Tried that maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and it worked, but it was such a headache to me that I canceled the whole thing and refunded everyone.
Wow, well, I remember contacting you, Tim, around 4 Hour Workweek in the really, really successful period of time just after, were saying, why aren't you doing a course behind this? Because I thought, wow, is this not the best time to be launching something like a continuity program or a $1,000 training product, something like that? Because you could really, off the massive exposure you had a huge selling program. And you said no. I don't want to do training in this area. I don't want to teach. I don't do content production. So I was surprised.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Seth, I had a conversation with Seth Godin once, and we were talking about speaking engagements because I had overcommitted to speaking and I ended up hating it because I was doing it all the time and talking about the same crap over and over again. And just like, you can only talk about email autoresponders so many times. And I asked him about his rules for choosing gigs. And basically what he said was, you're either on the road all the time or you pick and choose your speaking gigs and you do a handful. And what he said to me was, and for whatever reason, this really struck a chord with me, you can only eat so many M&Ms. And meaning, just like with money, like once you've had enough money and you have enough money to really enjoy yourself, like you don't need to do miserable stuff to make more money. And it's very easy to forget that. And I still have to remind myself of this because it's seductive to make a lot of money. It really is. But when I look at the life that I built for myself, like it's kind of my lifestyle. It's my game to lose. And I think a lot of people, if you're fortunate enough to find success, and I think you can engineer it, financial success, you will have to take the workaholic behaviors that perhaps made you successful in the very beginning and change them very dramatically, or you'll continue to try to make yourself miserable. So just remember, you can only eat so many M&Ms.
That's the first of the 3 interviews I have for you today with Tim Ferriss. The next one is coming up. That was my interview with Tim when he released the 4 Hour Chef. But first, I'd like to tell you about inboxdone.com, the sponsor for Vested Capital, which is my company. I'm the co-founder of this business with my co-founder, Claire. We created Inbox Done to help people who are drowning in email and customer support and using their inbox like a to-do list that keeps grabbing your attention. So you're just not having enough time to get stuff done to move your business forward. Now, I think Tim Ferriss is a perfect example to why a service like Inbox Done is so helpful. He was possibly the first person to truly make the idea of delegation something everyone on the planet could possibly do. We could all benefit from having a virtual assistant to hand over certain tasks. And certainly for us business owners, us entrepreneurs, having a person or a team of people to do things for us is one of the most important steps you can take in order to grow your business. You can't grow a big business without help. And for a lot of people, email is the sticking point, and maybe your calendar as well. 2 things that at Inbox Done we help you do. So we will assign to you 2 inbox managers who will work in tandem to manage and reply to your email and also manage your calendar and any other admin or customer service related tasks around email and messaging you might have. We assign you 2 because we want to offer redundancy, which means if someone has a holiday or needs to go on sick leave, we don't come back to you and tell you that you're back in charge of your email for a month while we find a replacement or we wait for them to get back from holiday. We have 2 people always there. So you've got that double extra protection of people managing your inbox. Because trust me, once you've delegated your email and your calendar to someone else, you're not going to want to take that task back. It's like flying first class. You don't want to go back to coach. So if you would like the benefit of an Inbox Manager 2, of course, as we assign to most people, then all you have to do is head to inboxdone.com. You can learn about the service there and then book in a call, which will be done most likely with me. And we'll talk about what kind of emails you need help with. What's the ideal situation? Are you looking to no longer ever go into your inbox? How do we communicate with you? What does it look like to hand over something like email? What's the process we go through? It's quite a lengthy, detailed, careful process we take you through to take over your email. It's not a quick process. It's going to take a month or more to fully take over these important tasks from you. But that's why we're specialists. We've been doing this now for 4 years for all kinds of clients. We're very good at handling email, which frankly is not something a lot of generalist virtual assistants are good at doing. So if you want specialists and also you get what you pay for, you've got to really get the superior communicators if you want them to manage email. And that's what we provide. So head to inboxdone.com and I'd love to talk to you more on a discovery call. Okay, that's it from our sponsor. Now we're going to dive into interview number 2 with Tim Ferriss, all about the 4 Hour Chef and optimizing your ability to learn new skills. Here we go.
And today I have probably one of the most fun guests you could have on an interview, Mr. Timothy Ferriss. Tim, thank you for joining me.
Oh, well, thank you for the Very kind introduction. I'm excited to be here.
I say fun because everything about your life seems to be fun, Tim. So I don't know how you squeeze it all in, which is really what we're here to talk about. Obviously, people will know you already. I'm sure there's not a single person listening to this who hasn't heard of at least the 4 Hour Workweek. That's something I've talked about many times before on my blog. 4 Hour Body, your sequel to that. And now the latest book is The 4 Hour Chef. So that's what we're here to talk about, among other things. And I've done a quick little background check because I don't know much about The 4 Hour Chef besides the obvious title. It's got to have something to do with cooking. But I can see there's two aspects to this. You've got the cooking and you've got the, I guess, productivity, lifestyle design, how you learn to do things well quickly. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a cookbook for any skill disguised as a cookbook for food. That's the short version. Because my readers have been asking me for a book on rapid learning for 4 or 5 years now. And I thought the most entertaining way to do that would be to take a skill that involves all the senses, which is unusual, cooking, to take a skill that had kicked my ass several times, which a lot of people aren't aware of. There are skills that defeat me. Cooking is it. And then to, from start to finish, travel around the world, meeting the world's best chefs and fastest learners, and take all their tips and tricks and put it in one place.
Now, Tim, I'm amazed by the amount of things you actually get done in your life thus far. I was just listening to an interview with you, and I don't know if I should say this publicly, but you did mention it publicly on the interview, that you used to be a breakdancer before you were into tango, which is obviously what people probably know about the tango part because you talked about that in your books. But breakdancing, not to mention Silicon Valley investor, obviously traveling around the world to view and study under chefs, to then write a book, which is, a full-time undertaking in itself, is writing a book. So, how do you make all this happen? Do you not sleep?
No, I actually sleep a lot. I love sleeping. I really love sleeping a lot. So I try to get 8 to 10 hours a night. It doesn't always happen. But I think the way I create the perception of getting a lot done. I mean, if you looked at me on a day-to-day basis, you'd be like, wow, this guy wastes a lot of time.
I don't want to hear that.
Just procrastinating a lot. No, but here's the secret. The secret is that I focus on being as effective as possible as opposed to being as efficient as possible. Or at least I focus on choosing the right things to do first. And then I can be kind of not mediocre in my execution, but if I procrastinate a little bit like everybody else, as long as I choose the right things, then I can get some pretty tremendous domino effects. And so what I mean by that is if I'm looking at, let's say, a hypothetical to-do list, I'll really take time to try to identify the one thing that, if accomplished, would affect everything else, or the one thing that, if accomplished, would render the other things I'm avoiding null and void and eliminate them. To find those force multipliers, and there aren't many. So it's like one thing every 3 months or whatever it might be, that if done, really just magnifies everything else, like an Archimedes lever. I think I'm good at habitually just taking the time to do that. And it allows me to get away with murder.
Can you explain with an example? What's the most recent one thing that you did? Was it today or this week or?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. I mean, in the case of, let's say, launching a book. So we have the 4 Hour Chef. I'm prouder of this book than of any book I've written. And I am proud of the other books, but this one I feel is like sort of the bedrock that allowed me to do all the other stuff. So I'm also being boycotted by Barnes & Noble, though. 600 plus stores in the US. It's the biggest retailer. And because I'm the first major book coming out of Amazon Publishing, I'm being boycotted. So that means I need to move, let's say, in my week, which is the week of Thanksgiving, super busy, 100,000 books probably to hit #1 book scan, which then translates to #1 Wall Street Journal. New York Times is fickle, so I might not even hit the New York Times regardless of how many copies I sell because of the retail boycott. So I need to look at the critical few things that will allow me to multiply the number of sales. So one of those, which I'll be doing, is a competition where I can turn my most devout readers and most capable readers into resellers of the book, where they can sell, let's say, 3 book packages, 30 book packages, 100 book packages, etc., and then be placed on a leaderboard where I can select the most effective and have them, fly them from anywhere in the world to San Francisco for 2 full days with me or something. Who knows? I haven't figured out all the details, but I know that if I execute that campaign
effectively, it should have the potential to move, between 10 and 30,000 books. That's a moving the needle type of endeavor, right? So if I have then another 1,000 things that I could do to promote the book, and let's face it, like there are 1,000 things you could do to promote a book, and there are at least 100 of them that are pretty attractive. But I will sort of rank them in order next to that one critical campaign, that one critical initiative, which is this group selling. So that would be a good example.
Okay. Tell us a little bit more about the book. So I don't want to forget about this part too, because obviously your first book, The 4 Hour Workweek, was sort of lifestyle design. It kind of introduced you to the world at large in a lot of ways. That's where I first heard about you. And from that point, we kind of learned that you were great at multitasking, or maybe that's not the right way to describe it, but you picked up a lot of skills quickly. You had a business that was very low labor intensive to make it work, or you set up different income streams that were like that, and you taught people how to do this. So it was sort of an outsourcing lifestyle design, mini vacations, travel, ultimately a 4-hour work week book. Really big hit the nail on the head. And I think for a lot of people, open their eyes to what is possible. Certainly not having a job is a real possibility thanks to the way we live our lives at the moment with the internet. Then the 4-hour body was, I guess, hacking your body, as your title described. And I mean, I read that book and I'm still amazed, again, how you managed to do so many different little experiments on yourself. It's a little bit twisted, to be honest, some of the stuff you did, but everything from losing weight to gaining weight to traveling down to third world countries to get medical procedures because it was cheaper there, things like that. So it was a nice extension, I guess, of the first ideas introduced in the 4-hour work week. The 4-hour chef, what's the big picture goal here? What are we trying to teach people?
Yeah, the big picture goal is to teach people how to really double or triple at least their learning speed with any skill. So rather than, let's say, tackling a language and it taking a lifetime to master, which is a common myth, or believing that adults learn languages slower than children, which is completely untrue, which you can prove with research, you can become functionally fluent in a language in 8 to 12 weeks. And so I'd like to teach people how to do that and how to do the same with just about any skill. I've systematically taken this sort of the grand recipe of all this meta learning process and applied it to like tango, breakdancing, basketball, swimming. I mean, I couldn't even swim until a few years ago, and now I do it to relax. And the way that I sort of tried to collect these methods and tips and tricks was by looking at people like Da Vinci, like Benjamin Franklin, Jobs, Nikola Tesla, who are really polymaths. Like, how do they do that? And I made a study of it. So it's to teach people how to learn like the world's fastest learners, basically. And Benjamin Franklin in particular is really interesting because his trinity was healthy, wealthy, and wise. And there are only kind of 3 main obsessions that I have that I think I've really done a deep dive on. And so healthy, 4-hour body; wealthy, 4-hour work week; and then wise is the 4-hour chef for me. It's the book on maximizing learning potential and human potential. So that's pretty much it. And I'm using the vehicle of cooking a lot like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance uses motorcycles to explain Zen and whatnot.
Reminds me of that tennis book. I think it's Tim Galloway. Oh, it's a similar concept, but title's lost me. The meta learning that you're talking about here, can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, over the last 15 years, starting in college where I did a lot of experimentation with smart drugs of different types like vasopressin or desmopressin and synthetic version, and was in neuroscience labs and whatnot. From the very beginning, I mean, I've been obsessed with how to accelerate learning. And meta learning is just a step-by-step process that you can impose on any skill to make it easier to learn. And the general acronym is DISS to remember. So DISSS, there are 3 S's. And it's deconstruction, which is figuring out the Lego blocks of a given skill, breaking it down into different pieces. And that could apply to anything. I mean, poker, basketball, doesn't matter. Second step is selection, so doing an 80-20 analysis to pick the 20% of those Lego blocks that produce 80% of the results you want. Then sequencing, so putting them in the right order, which is really important. So it's like, a lot of people who play golf think they have bad form, or in fact, they're just moving pieces, the portions of their body in the incorrect order, which is what Stan Utley, a great golf coach, talks about a lot. And then the last S is stakes. So how do you failure-proof behavioral change, or how do you failure-proof practice so that you create the carrot and the stick so that there's a consequence, sort of building in an insurance policy that you actually do what you're supposed to do, whether it's vocabulary cards or going out and lifting weights or whatever. Then there are other parts sort of in the advanced level of the meta learning where you're looking really closely at frequency, cramming, how to cram like 6 months of culinary school into 48 hours, which is something I actually did with the help of a couple of chefs. And it was super, super intense, but teaches a lot of interesting principles when you try something like that. Or in coding, where you take really slippery material like Japanese characters or memorizing a deck of cards in 60 seconds or less, which one world champion in memory taught me how to do. How to take material that's really hard to grasp and turn it into something that's easier to grasp. And that's the general process. And it took me a long time to figure this out, because if you look at, let's say, me learning languages, I failed in Spanish for multiple years and decided that I was bad at languages until I stumbled upon a few things in Japan when I was there as an exchange student, and I learned Japanese in a year using comic books and judo textbooks. So I learned Japanese to read, write, speak in a year. Then I refined it, learned Mandarin in 6 months, refined it, tweaked it, refined it, German in 3 months, and then Spanish in about 8 weeks. So I've just been refining this process over the last decade or so, and finally feel confident enough in it that it can go in a book. So that's why it's taken so freaking long.
Well, it's an exciting proposition, Tim. I'm looking forward to reading. I'd love to grab 4 or 5 languages in the next 4 or 5 months. So maybe not first attempt from me will be that quick, but I only speak this Canadian Australian language. So now, is there an example right now that you could tell us that you're personally learning? And I'm kind of hoping, because I just saw you update Facebook, that you booked a private tennis lesson. I'm a big tennis fan, that maybe tennis is on the cards here for what you're currently learning how to improve in. Is that something?
Tennis is one I'd really like to get better at, because I'm kind of a caveman. Whenever I've tried tennis, I just hit it like a baseball.
Yep.
And it doesn't work very well. So tennis is one I absolutely am going to dabble with it, try it out, see if I enjoy deconstructing tennis. And if I do, I'll definitely stick with it. Surfing and Indonesian, actually, Bahasa Indonesian and surfing I'm very interested in, because I could potentially do both at the same time if I go to Indonesia. So those are 2 on the horizon for me, for sure. And what I would emphasize is that when people see my bio, they think that I've had this, incredible life, start to finish, amassing all these incredible skills. And it's just not really true. Like 80% of it's in the last few years. And it's because I've settled on this process for acquiring all this stuff. And when people finish 4 Hour Chef, what I want them to believe wholeheartedly is that rather than becoming world-class in 1 or 2 things per lifetime, they could become world-class, like top 5% in the world in 1 or 2 things per year. I really want people to believe that and to go after these things they've assumed they could never be good at. And, whether it's playing the guitar or who the hell knows, anything. Anyway, I get super passionate about this.
I like that goal. I think that's, I'm trying to think of the person listening to this who might still be at the phase where they're working a 9-to-5 job and they're raising a couple of kids and looking after a spouse or maintaining a relationship, and just finding 30 minutes in a day to read your book is the first challenge for them, which seems quite distant from the idea of mastering 1 or 2 skills a year. I guess I want to know the answer to 2 questions, Tim. Like, to answer the question for the person I just described, is there a process you would suggest they go through? Maybe even read your books in order is the way to do this. Sort out the money, sort out the body, and then sort out the wisdom for that person listening to us. And I'm also curious to know what an average day in your life actually is now, when you get up and what you have for breakfast, and what do you get on the phone and talk about Silicon Valley deals you're doing, and are you hopping on a plane to go learn surfing in Bali where you can learn the language as well? Like, how does a day in the life of Tim Ferriss go?
Oh, man. Well, let me answer those in order. So I think that for somebody who only has 30 minutes a day, the good news is I always recommend, no matter how ambitious someone is that they start with the smallest possible change that creates a big impact that they'll actually do. So for fat loss, for instance, 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up. Just have a shake. You have 100 pounds to lose. Do not start with going to the gym. And I took my dad from 5 pounds of average fat loss to 18.75 pounds in 4 weeks of just adding 30 grams in the morning. No new exercise, Don't worry about changing your meals, just the protein. So starting small is where you want to go. In terms of the books and reading them in order, I think the order I wrote them is probably a good order to read them in, but you could even read the 4 Hour Chef first, because the good news is the underlying thread is 80-20 analysis, like finding the 20% of activities or people who produce 80% of what you want in life, the outcomes you want, whether in business or elsewhere. That's the same in all 3 books. So I feel like the principles that you can apply everywhere are reflected in each of the 3 books. That's the good news. It's kind of the same toolkit for all 3. As far as my average day goes, man, I don't really have an average day. I do have certain routines, though. I mean, like this past weekend, I was in Los Angeles taking a sniper course with snipers from the LA SWAT team. You know?
Why? Why, Tim?
Because I was just interested in it. And I met a Navy SEAL who introduced me to the head instructor. And he's like, yeah, I'll go with you and like coach you through it. I was like, well, not every day that you get that kind of offer. So I'll do it. It's not very much fun bringing guns to the airport. I'll tell you that much. Shipping guns around. TSA does not like that very much. But for instance, like this week is a very atypical because it's sort of launch time. But 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up, a mix of whey protein isolate and micellar casein. Wake up, I have pu'er tea. So I put on the water, put on the kettle, and I have Chinese pu'er tea, which has some really interesting health benefits, fat loss benefits, and also lights you up like a Christmas tree, which is useful. And I'd say a few days a week, I do 3 to 5 minutes of Vipassana meditation, seated but leaning back against a wall. So it's very comfortable. And I listen to one music track. And I use that as my state cue. So I'll just listen to one track, super short, 3 to 5 minutes, focusing on breathing. That's it. And then for this week, I tend to batch tasks on a daily or weekly basis. So rather than trying to do like phone calls for half of the day, emails for a quarter of the day, and then a quarter of the day doing A, B, C, D, and E, I really try to do today, all day phone calls. That's it. It's been all day phone calls. And then other days, for instance, Fridays, I try to reserve for all of my in-person meetings, like catching up with people, lunches, drinks, happy hour, breakfast, whatever. I try to do all my in-person stuff on the same day. And I find the cognitive cost of task switching is really minimized that way. And you can just be in the zone for a longer period of time because your brain gets in the flow of doing one type of thing. And then typically at night, I like 1 or 2 glasses of red wine as my habitual wind down. And then I like to either watch like a comedy or read fiction before I go to bed to turn me off of problem-solving mode. I like to get out of problem-solving mode and sort of transport it outside of my head for the last 30 to 60 minutes of the day, and then pop in a mouthpiece so I don't grind my teeth, put on my eye mask, and go to bed.
And wake up and see what the next day brings.
Exactly.
Right. So I've always been curious, Tim, about something that I'm sure you can explain a lot about. Have you always been a writer?
No way. Is there more to the question? Is that
there is. When did you start?
Okay. So I've never thought I was going to be a writer. I did take writing courses here and there, partially because they're required, but never thought I was going to be a writer. I did take one class that very greatly influenced me, however, which was called The Literature of Fact in college, and was taught by John McPhee, who's a staff writer for The New Yorker and has won the Pulitzer Prize. So he's as good as he gets. And his course was really, really eye-opening to me for a few reasons. The first was that I remember when we got our first writing assignments back, and he said, "Don't be concerned. You're all good writers." And I was just wondering as he handed them out, I'm like, what's this preamble about? And then I got my writing back, and his red marks, there's more red ink than the original black ink I had put down. And he tore it to pieces. And there were all these superfluous adjectives and ridiculous adverbs and like sentences that were flowery, but at the end didn't add any value. And what was really fascinating about that was that as my writing improved, as my writing became clearer and crisper, my thinking improved. And so my grades in all of my other classes went up.
And how old were you when this was happening?
This was senior year in college. So I have no idea, early 20s, I guess, something like that. And then I had to write my senior thesis, learned to hate writing yet again, and promised after graduating that I would never write anything longer than a short email for the rest of my life. Clearly, that did not work out as planned. But the only reason that I ended up writing the 4 Hour Workweek was because I enjoyed teaching, and I was invited back to Princeton to teach a high-tech entrepreneurship lecture twice a year, just one day each time. And I had feedback forms. I always wanted feedback. That's my thing, right? Tracking feedback. And one of the students in the comments section of the feedback form, in pretty typical Princeton snarky fashion, said, "I don't know why you're teaching a class of 50 students. Why don't you just write a book and be done with it?" And so I got this stupid idea in my head, this seed planted, like, what if I were to write a book? Like, I don't want to. Last thing I want to do, that'd be ridiculous. But like, I wonder what I would write. Like, if I were to write a book, what would it be about?
What were you teaching at that class, though, Tim? Was that 4-hour workweek principles or something different?
How to build a profitable startup or business without outside financing, and also how to use direct response advertising and things like that to do so. So at that point in time, I was actually taught that specific class from Argentina when I was doing tango and like having my own sort of crisis and walkabout around the planet. So I started at night. I would go to bed and I had these stupid ideas about the book, and I'd just take notes on my bedside stand to get them out of my head so I could go to sleep, because I had really bad insomnia at the time. And this stack of notes just grew and grew and grew and grew. And eventually I explained this to one of my buddies who was a writer, just jokingly. I was like, "Yeah, I have a book's worth of notes already." Like, ha, ha, ha. And he said, "Oh, well, you should send it to my agent, see what he thinks." And I was like, okay. And so I sent it to a few of his friends, not just one, who were agents. Everyone was like, not interested, except for one guy named Steve Hanselman, who's still my agent to this day. He's like, "Yeah, we should make it a book. Absolutely. Totally get it." And we put together a proposal, sent it out to a ton of publishers. Only a fraction replied. 27 people replied. 26 people said hell no, in pretty rude terms usually. And then one, the final, Crown, bought the book for a pittance. And nobody expected anything really. I think the initial print run was 12,000 copies. And here we are, accidental career.
Amazing. So, and now you're a blogger as well. You write some fairly lengthy blog posts. Do you do any other forms of writing?
I'm not sure if we want to count Twitter and Facebook as right. No, I'd say, the blog and the books. And I think I'm done with doing thousands of experiments on myself for 600-page books for a while, because it takes a ton out of me. I mean, I think it's just brutal. I mean, but I cut 250 pages from the 4 Hour Chef, and it's 672 pages still. But it's choose your own adventure book. So a lot like the 4 Hour Body, I don't expect anyone to read more than 100 pages at a time, because you kind of dip in and dip out of the stuff that you want.
It is amazing that your late night brain dumping to try and get to sleep was the catalyst to create a book and lead to the career you've had with the 4 Hour series. Yeah. Can you maybe tell us, though, I'm sure this is not how the 4 Hour Chef came together. This wasn't late night brain dumping and doodles on little coffee paper or anything like that. This was a coordinated experimental traveling around the world. Can you explain from the point of conception of a book like this to going about the actual experiments and recording and tracking the results to then actually sitting down and writing the book? Did you batch process all of that the way you doing a day of interviews today? Did you do, a month of traveling with chefs and then a month of writing the book? How did you do it?
Yeah, I did it mostly that way. One catastrophe that hit me, which really screwed up my plans, was my right-hand man, like my COO, right in the middle of the process, had a bunch of family crises and had to stop working, basically. And so my shield against the outside world, which was allowing me to focus on the book, disappeared. And that was a total disaster. So I really had to get good at time management and organization to an extent that was like multiple magnitudes of order beyond anything I'd done before. Total disaster. I mean, I had not been to like the breaking point since like 2000, and this project definitely took me there. And I think some of my best work came out of it as a result. But the short answer is, the book idea crystallized when a few things happened simultaneously. Number one, I really did want to write a book on learning, but I was looking for the most entertaining context to do that through. A good friend of mine also around the same time said, it would be really fun, because these other books, like you go out, you try everything, you learn everything, and then you tell people. He's like, what would be really fun for your readers is to see you start from total idiot in a skill, ground zero, clumsy and totally terrible, and then walk them through the process of getting good at it. These all happened at the same time. I was also around that time feeling this very acute digital malaise where I wanted to start building things with my hands. I just closing the laptop and having done stuff virtually just wasn't enough. I wanted to build something like a, birdhouse or whatever, but it was inconvenient to like go to a woodworking shop. And then I watched my girlfriend who learned to cook while watching her grandmother cooking. And I was like, wow, well, I eat 3 times a day. Cooking has kicked my ass many times. Maybe I should try cooking. And, all of these things happened simultaneously. And that's how the idea started to come together.
When was this? It's about a couple of years ago, Tim, or
2 years ago?
Right.
Probably 2 years ago. And the other thing that was happening is, people who were on the 4 Hour Body were like, oh, I'm bored with this, this, and this. Like, I need other types of foods. I'm really bored of eating like canned beans every day. So I was like, well, what if I could make a cookbook that was actually a book on learning, where all the recipes are slow carb compliant, but nobody will know because they're amazing and you never be hungry, except for the cheat meals. Those are epic, but that's a separate story. And like, what if I could wrap it all into one? That was like 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And then sold the book to Amazon Publishing, which was a first in the front of the New York Times and everything. And that was quite a process because, Amazon was just getting into obviously publishing. So it was a big risk. But my feeling was, I've done the traditional thing twice. I'd like to try something new. Like I'd like to experiment. And then the actual writing process was very different from the first book. So now I have tools and organization that I just didn't have that time around. So now I use Evernote, the application Evernote, for almost all of my research and gathering all of the bits and pieces. I use for any design elements or capturing visual inspiration or anything like that. I also use Evernote. But in addition to that, for interacting with my teams, that was a huge headache with the last 2 books, was all the email and the Word documents and terrible. So Evernote. Then to write, I write in a program called Scrivener, which is usually used by screenwriters and novelists, but it's great. It allows me to have all of my documents in one view. So I'm not like opening all these different windows in Word and having it crash and all that crap. So Scrivener. Then for any kind of design feedback, because this book has more than 1,500 photos in it, I use Sketch for screenshots where I can just point out things I want to move around or change. And then I use ScreenFlow. So ScreenFlow allows me to just take video of my screen as I talk over it with video or without video. And that saves dozens of hours. And the heartbeat of all this, I have 2 main home bases for all of this stuff that I just mentioned. So one is Dropbox. So I'll put like all the videos, all the screenshots, everything into Dropbox so that people can download them at their leisure and they're all centralized. And then for communication, rather than relying on email, I use Basecamp. So Basecamp by 37 Signals is what I use for instance, right now I have one project is 4HC, 4 Hour Chef launch, right? And that's where all the information for my calls this week are and the calendar for all those calls. Then I have 4HC site, which is all the 4 Hour Chef website related stuff. 4HC sidebars, that's for editorial stuff, and so on and so forth. So it's very systematized now, and that's kind of my work for this current book and probably the workflow that I'll use for anything I do moving forward, although I'm taking a break from this book nonsense.
And before we talk about your future, which doesn't include books, how long would it take? Like, obviously a book like this is not a narrative where you're telling a story, or maybe it is because you've been telling a story in your other books, your own sort of story. Do you write it all at once, or do you sit down and do an experiment, write about that? How does it come together?
Yeah, so this book is highly, highly narrative, really narrative, because I really think that storytelling is the best way to teach. So there's a ton of storytelling in this. And the way that I write it is typically getting notes from anything handwritten to digital as quickly as possible. So typically I'll take my notes by hand, then I'll go through and I'll highlight the pieces that I think are interesting. I will number those in the order that I think they should appear in a given section, and then I'll put them into something like Evernote, for instance. I find that all of my friends who write consistently and put out a decent amount of content that's good write best between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. So they either go to bed really late or they wake up really early. And I think that's really simple to explain. I think it's because it's easiest to concentrate when the rest of the world is freaking asleep or it's not on the internet, like knocking on your door. So I write best, I synthesize best after 10 p.m. What that means is I'll do all of my interviews, all of my experiments, everything like that during the day. And if I'm doing synthesis, and sometimes it's like a week at a time of just experiments, But when I do my synthesis, it's almost always between 10 p.m. and I stay up late. So I'll do like 10 p.m. until I run out of steam. And if the spirit's moving me and I'm in the zone, I'll keep on going until I face plant. But that's my general process. This is another key. When I'm structuring my books, the choose your own adventure aspect to my books, where you can read them out of the chapters out of order in many cases and so forth, is fun for the reader, and it's easier to digest, I think, but it's also easier for me to write, because if I get stuck on a chapter, I can skip to something else and keep working on that. And if you're writing a book that has a really strict sequence, it's very difficult to do that, because you could write one piece later and then you go back to write something earlier and you're like, oh man, now I have to rewrite this, this, and this, because each piece is dependent on the next. So I really try to make each chapter a self-contained magazine article with a beginning, middle, and an end, so I can move it around.
I like that. It's a nice way of feeling a sense of completion too as you complete each section.
Oh yeah, it's great. Otherwise, you're just like, a freaking book, really? Oh my God. And it's like looking at something on your Kindle where you're like, really? Been reading for an hour. I'm only like 0.5% through it. Oh my God.
Yeah. So you mentioned Basecamp and a group of people who are working with you. Who are they, and then what do they do?
Well, it's different for different phases, right? So for the actual book production side, I had probably maybe a dozen photographers working at different times, many of which I supervised. I had some photo shoots that I supervised in New York City and San Francisco myself, illustrators, a handful of illustrators, many chefs, people being interviewed, many of which were interviewed by me, some of which were interviewed by people I hired as professional interviewers who had done journalism and wrote for magazines and newspapers and so forth. For the launch, and then of course designers, and it was like running a startup. It was very much like running a 30 or 40 person startup, without a doubt, and had all the hierarchy necessary to do that. On the launch side of things, I have publicists in the US, publicists who are going to be working overseas, some of which report directly to me, some of which report directly to like an executive publicist that I interact with. Then I have a team of people that, for instance, you've interacted with, I think Alex, maybe Ryan.
Yes, Ryan and Alex.
Yeah, who are spearheading my digital organization for launch. Then I have all of the people at Amazon who've actually been awesome to work with, because they're really like aggressive, nimble tech company. And you wouldn't think of like $100 billion company as nimble, but they're really freaking fast. And Amazon Publishing has the benefit of being a startup. It's new, so they're scrappy, which I love. So I have director of marketing that I deal with there, editors and so forth, of course, but it's yet another like SWAT team that I'm working with on the marketing and promotional side. So it's super exciting. But with a project of this scope, it's been really, really important to find people I think are world-class and bring them in to do things that not only I don't have the bandwidth to do, but things that they'll do better than I can do. So I think I've become better at selecting talent as well over the last few years, which is a skill unto itself. The best book I've found on interviewing for that type of talent is Top Grading, but the old edition, not the new editions, which are kind of just upsells to like programs and nonsense. The old edition that has content in the book itself is what you want, like the first edition.
The original Top Grading.
Yep.
Okay, I guess that explains how you brought together your team. And I assume that's a mixture of local and contracting out overseas, the old Philippines, Indians, Ukrainians, that.
Wherever the best talent is, man, I don't care where they are. I mean, I had people doing illustration in Singapore. I had people doing illustration in Australia. I had people doing audio for video that we're putting together in, Estonia, Lithuania. I don't care where they are, as long as they're really, really good. So yeah, definitely a mix of people, domestic and overseas.
Okay, now, Tim, we'll start to wrap this up. I'm excited about the book, obviously. It's amazing to see what goes into something like this, too. When you hear it broken down like that, it's a big job. It's not a case of sitting in a cafe and writing a couple of thousand words a day for a few months and you're done. You've put a lot into this. But you've also said that this is potentially, maybe not your last book, but you're not going to do it again for a while. Of course, you got to be careful when you say things like that, because you never know what happens next year, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What are you thinking then for the future? Like, what still floats your boat? Is it shooting people in sniper school, or?
No, we were shooting steel targets, which is really. Although a lot of people like, what are you shooting? And I'm like, abandoned kittens. They're pretty slow moving. I was kidding, of course. I actually had some people believe me. It's like my IQ test. But I'm really excited about, honestly, is teaching. And books are just one method of teaching. So I'm 35. I don't have too many years left of this, like running around doing crazy, ridiculous stuff to myself. Once I have a family, I'm not going to want to do all the extreme human guinea pig stuff because it's just too much. And I do all that pushing the envelope so my readers don't have to, but I would still like to do some. So I really want to experiment with television and video and the visual medium. So I could see TV or some type of episodic teaching with crazy experiments and environments and settings as my next step. I think I'd really enjoy that. And, the idea, because I've done some TV in the past, and the idea of just being able to film an entire season in 2 months and to have the entire year to look forward to that stuff and to have teams who are working on post-production. So I'm not like reading my own goddamn chapters 700 times myself. It's very appealing. And certainly before I'm not willing to take some of these physical risks and, jump off buildings or whatever, I'd like to capture that. It'd be kind of fun to have a diary of that stuff. So we'll see, but that's where I'm leaning.
You could even begin that with webisodes. That seems to be the place people start now.
Yeah, certainly could. Geez Louise. It's like, I know when you look at some of these YouTube channels, I've met some of the superstars, and it's like they have 5 times as many YouTube subscribers as they would ever get on a cable show.
Exactly.
It's amazing. It's
the leverage is there. There's too many channels now for one show to get that big, I think. So something about YouTube.
So that's where I think I'll probably be playing around next.
Okay, we'll look forward to seeing that, Tim. I look forward to hopefully one day getting down to San Francisco and hanging out with this crowd. I'm assuming you have some interesting friends that you hang out with on a regular basis down there too.
Oh yeah. They make me look like decaf. What's funny is like when I hear people say like, "Oh man, you're so intense and you seem so productive," I'm like, you should meet my friends. Like I'm purely a product of my peer group. They make me look like the laziest, most disorganized guy you can imagine. So it's a good crew out here. You should definitely come and hang out, have some wine and some good food.
All right. So to wrap it up, Tim, obviously 4 Hour Chef, where is the best place to get info about that?
Yeah, 4 Hour Chef. Amazon's going to be the cheapest place to get it probably. Definitely designed it to be the optimal experience in print, although the digital will be great. Like I kind of planned it by 2-page spreads. But 4hourchef.com will have all sorts of goodies on it. And then one offer for people if they're interested, if they buy 3 copies of the book, it is the ultimate holiday book. And I feel very comfortable saying that because I killed myself to make it that. 1,500 photos, tons of illustrations, Calvin and Hobbes, supermodels. It's got something for everybody. So
Calvin and Hobbes supermodels, are those 2 separate things? Or
Yeah, those are 2 separate.
Okay.
But if you get 3 copies of the print book, 2 for gifts, just send the Amazon receipt to 3books@4hourchef.com. So the number 3 books spelled out, obviously, at 4, the number 4, hourchef.com. And I will invite you to an exclusive 1 to 2 hour Q&A, live Q&A with me the week after launch. And I'll grab a bottle of wine. You can ask me anything that you want. So if you get 3 books, there's that as well. But either way, I want people to at least start pushing a little bit on the things that they've held off on trying to learn, because there are adventures to be had.
And you're doing them all at the same time. So it's inspiring, to say the least. I'll put the links to clarify those details along with the blog post that goes with this podcast and the transcript as well. Tim, that's it. Any last words before we say goodbye?
No, what I would say is just, and this sounds morbid, but this is part of the reason why I really do, I don't have any problem with hard work as long as it's applied to the right things. And I think that's clear if you read the 4 Hour Workweek. And like the reason that I bleed out my eyeballs for a book like the 4 Hour Chef, and this was really a brutal process to put this thing together, but it's because I've had some of my friends pass away in the last few years, whether through accidents or sickness. And it's like, life is short. And I think that the most incredible force multiplier that you can possibly have is by like doubling or tripling your learning potential. And that's something you can pass on to your kids and everything. So it sounds kind of somber, kind of serious, but it's legitimate. And so I just encourage people to take life seriously. It's non-renewable. So at least as far as we know. So and that would be the comment.
And I think you'd be the first person to agree that just because you pass 30 or 40 or 50 doesn't mean your learning capacity decreases, right?
Not at all. And actually, I can prove that adults learn languages faster than kids. And plus, it's like, talk to any 3-year-old. Like, their English is not so hot. Like, you can do a lot better. So you absolutely can tackle anything. I mean, Colonel Sanders started Kentucky Fried Chicken when he was like 60 years old. So it's never too late to get started.
All right, that is the second interview with Tim Ferriss. I hope you enjoyed it. What I really appreciate and respect about Tim is how multidimensional he is. He has gone from being, your typical side hustle entrepreneur to becoming a very well-known, respected author, despite not being the kind of person who loves to write, to then graduating to become a full-blown angel investor, doing incredibly well, connecting with some very smart people, some early startups that today are multi-billion-dollar companies like Uber and Spotify. Then he transitioned to becoming essentially a podcaster and has become one of the most well-known podcasters. So he's got a bit of a Midas touch. It seems like everything he does turns to gold. You can tell why, though. He's a smart guy and he puts in the work to do all these experiments and to learn what works and just to do good marketing and do good content. That has been certainly a consistent key throughout everything. He's a great founder. He's a great marketer. He's a great content creator. Now, all those characteristics are very much what I focus on here at the Vested Capital podcast. So I love getting angel investors and startup founders on the show. Certainly people who are very successful with growing capital, creating cash flow, and then investing that capital into other streams of income that quite often are income streams that run without you. Like for a lot of us, we start with a muse, a side business like Tim, that allows us to break free. Then we create income streams that are not dependent on our labor. We systematize our business. Maybe we have an exit, and then we become potential investors in whatever vehicle for investing we like, whether it's crypto, property, other startups via angel investing, or some sort of venture capital. And that's the kind of person that you're going to hear from as a subscriber to this podcast, Vested Capital. So if you love hearing from Tim, you'll love hearing from all the other guests I've had on the show. You can go back and listen to many other startup founders and investors in the back catalog of Vested Capital. Plus, to make sure you get all of the new episodes as I release them, you have to subscribe. So hit that plus button, that bookmark button, that follow button, the like button if you're doing this on YouTube, wherever it is you happen to be listening to my show. Subscribe, and that way you'll get everything as I release it. And tell your friends, this episode with Tim Ferriss might be the perfect episode to open the eyes of a certain family member or spouse or colleague at work or just a friend, a person who's important in your life who needs to hear this sort of advice from a person like Tim that might break them out of certain patterns of thought that they're stuck in that you feel are holding them back. So just send them to Vested Capital episode 18 with Tim Ferriss, and they'll get all 3 interviews as you are enjoying right now. And speaking of which, let's dive into my very first original interview with Tim Ferriss, all about his first book that put him on the map, the 4 Hour Workweek. Here we go. Timothy Ferriss, or Tim Ferriss, the author of the 4 Hour Workweek, which is a book I just finished reading. Thanks for joining us today, Tim.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This book is literally everywhere at the moment. It's certainly very prolific, is the best way to put it. So you have to, though, explain for the people that have not read it before and maybe haven't heard of Tim Ferriss. What are you all about, and what have you done, and what's the book all about?
I'll try to give you the nutshell. So I'm a guest lecturer at Princeton University in high-tech entrepreneurship, and over the last 3 years or so, I have traveled through more than 20 countries, automating both myself, my own life, and my business. So seeing to what extent it was possible to outsource and automate your life in a digital and a flat world. And the combination of the content of my Princeton class as well as my experiences over the last few years, really looking at things like virtual outsourcing and outsourcing your life, is the 4 Hour Workweek. That's the content of the book. And it also contains case studies of people I met along the way who have really designed ideal lifestyles for themselves by understanding that there are 3 currencies in a digital world. And in descending order of importance, those are time, income, and mobility. So really using time and mobility to multiply the lifestyle output of your money, essentially. So one thing I talk about quite a bit in the book is that people talk about being a millionaire, but what they really want is not to have $1 million in the bank, but the lifestyle that they perceive is limited to people who have $1 million. And realistically, you can do that with $50,000 or $60,000 quite easily. in today's day and age. So that's the book. As far as my background, people often ask me, what do you do? Which is, of course, the hardest question for me to answer, because what I do for income and what I do with my time are two very different things. But I compete as a fighter. I've been national champion in kickboxing. I hold a Guinness World Record in the tango because I competed in tango in Argentina for 6 months. I've been on television in Hong Kong and China as an FBI agent in a hit TV series. I've been a breakdancer on MTV in Taiwan. The list goes on and on and on. But I'm also the founder and CEO of a company with sales distribution in more than 15 countries with somewhere between 200 and 300 full-time and contracted employees. So I do have a very strong business side as well. That's the nutshell. But actually, one last piece as far as background is I grew up in a very low to middle income family. My parents never made more than $50,000 a year combined, and I've been working since age 14, so I don't come from an extremely financially privileged background either.
Okay, so given then your background, you have middle income parents, what point in your life did you realize that you maybe didn't have to work terribly hard in order to live the kind of lifestyle you want to live? Because I'm assuming you weren't born with this insight and you didn't go straight away and create this fantastic lifestyle. You had to learn that through experience. Would that be right?
No, that's absolutely right. And I think it began with a book I read when I was 15, actually, by Dan Kennedy called How to Make Millions with Your Ideas. And it exposed me to things like private labeling and licensing, things that I'd never considered before. I began to realize that it was possible to separate income from hours. So you didn't have to work for an hourly or an annual rate. It's been an evolutionary process for me. I think another point was when I was at Princeton, I worked for $8 an hour in a library attic, and there was no heat, there's no ventilation whatsoever. It was a miserable experience. And drawing back on what I had read in a few interviews I'd done for different magazines, I actually formed a seminar to teach people different accelerated learning techniques, mnemonics, things of that type. And I charged $50 per person and ended up making more than $1,500 in my first seminar, which was 3 hours long. So I realized at that point that this could actually work. And the limitation on that model with the seminars was, of course, that if I didn't license it, and I didn't find it terribly interesting after the first few weeks, if I didn't license it, it still required me to be present. So I began looking at ways of productizing that expertise so that it would be more scalable, so that I could sell $1,000 as easily as I could 100, or even by extension sell $1 million as easily as I could 1,000. Right. And I really didn't put those principles into practice until I would say 2001, 2002. So it took me some time to actually sit down and implement them properly.
You're 28 or 29 years old?
29.
29, right. So you're like me, I'm turning 28 this year. So, I mean, to even get to that point at this young age is quite, it's good to have that realization from the early days. I'd hate to be realizing that we're not after self-employment situations by the time you hit our 50s or something like that. So,
yeah, very true.
Yeah. I'm curious though. I mean, obviously the principle here is to have a 4-hour work week. And there's a lot of people I know from my listeners and my readers who they're at usually a crossroads. They definitely have a strong interest in entrepreneurship and running their own business, but they're trapped in full-time jobs, and that, the standard story that is that they work very hard during the day, they come home and they're too tired to do anything else. I mean, I've read the book, so I've got your advice from that for the people who are employed. But can you give just a nutshell explanation of what you do teach people who are in that situation in order to start creating some of those freedoms so that they can essentially work less and play more, or live the kind of lifestyle that you're talking about?
Sure, absolutely. So if you're in a full-time job that you perceive is requiring you to put in 80, 90 hours a week, it's very hard to develop the entrepreneurial income sources that I talk about in one section of the book. The principles can be applied even if you remain in your job, but certainly the automation of income is much easier if you do have some type of muse, as I call them.
Explain a muse.
So a muse, when people say I want to start a business, I find the term business to be too ambiguous, because a business could refer to a lemonade stand in the same way that it refers to a Big Five oil conglomerate. So I find it too amorphous to be of use. So you can start businesses to change the world, like a body shop. You can start businesses to have them acquired or to reach an IPO. But in our particular case, I limit the scope of business to a vehicle that provides the income necessary to actualize your ideal lifestyle in terms of having and doing. So what is your target monthly income? That is, if you want to have an Aston Martin DB9 and go to Fiji once a year and have X, Y, and Z and do X, Y, and Z, what is the average monthly cost of that? And then what is the most efficient cash flow source to get you to that figure? And that's a muse. The only purpose of a muse is to free your time and satisfy your financial needs and wants as it relates to that target monthly income. So the first steps that you need to take, of course, number one is to define that target monthly income. So trying to get to the 4-hour work week before you define your desired outcome is a futile exercise. You really need to take a step back and stop reacting to overstimulation so that you can reassess your direction and what you're spending time on. A very easy way to create that space to begin with is, and this would be an example of elimination versus organization. So I'm not a very strong proponent of time management in the traditional sense because I feel that it doesn't scale. There's a limit to the number of tasks you can put in Outlook calendar and the number of things you can consume and digest similarly in a day. So I focus on elimination. So one concrete example of that is limiting the number of times you check email per day and batching that. So what I mean by that is you could create an autoresponder, and this is sometimes called vacation auto response, that tells everyone who sends you an email, "Dear all, in an effort to escape the inbox and get real work accomplished, or because of pending deadlines or increased workload, I'm currently checking email at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m., whatever your time zone is. If you need an urgent response before one of those two times, please contact me at," and then you provide your phone number. "And thank you for your understanding this move to effectiveness and efficiency so I can serve everyone better." And what that automatically does is it creates the breathing room to focus on, first of all, defining what your target monthly income is and what your target lifestyle is. Secondly, reassessing the vehicle, i.e. your full-time job, to see if it's getting you closer to that. And then in all cases, both with your full-time job and ultimately the business that you create, the muse, is doing a very strict 80-20 analysis and identifying what the 20% of activities are that produce 80% of your desired outcomes. So that outcome could be profit. So what 20% of my customers, what 20% of my activities, what 20% of the people I associate with are producing 80% of my profit. And then ruthlessly eliminating the inverse of that. So the 20% of the people and activities that consume 80% of your time. And if you do those two things, even in a full-time job, you can begin to focus on being productive instead of being busy. Because most people, since they're in a 9-to-5 office environment, or if they come from that environment, even when they start their own company, they believe that they have to be doing something at all times from 9 to 5. So they invent minutia, and those minutia begin to drive out the more important tasks. So the 4 steps that I outline in the 4-hour work week are the commonalities I've found among people, both employees, CEOs, and entrepreneurs, that has enabled them to have a 4-hour work week, or somewhere between a 40-hour work week and a 4-hour work week. So 10 hours, 15 hours, whatever they choose, their input will be. And the steps are definitions. We talked about a few examples of that: target monthly income, the 80-20 analysis, elimination, which would be doing the inverse 80-20. So eliminating the activities and people that consume that time. Then you have automation and liberation. And I talk about liberation with employees, full-time employees, quite often, because there's actually a broad spectrum of entrepreneurship between full-time employee and full-time entrepreneur or full-time business owner. So I use the term entrepreneur to refer to someone as the way that it was originally coined. So Jean-Baptiste J.B. Say coined the term entrepreneur to mean someone who moves resources from an area of low yield to an area of high yield. And that could mean that you're a full-time employee who simply negotiates a remote work agreement, perhaps 1 day a week, and then extends that to 2-3 days a week so that you have the freedom to eliminate unimportant tasks or minimally important tasks. And then that could evolve naturally to being a moonlighter or someone who splits their time 50-50, perhaps using those remote days to focus on their own muses after they've eliminated some of the non-essentials, all the way to the full-time business owner. And I say business owner as opposed to entrepreneur because most entrepreneurs are very good technicians. That's a term that Michael Gerber would use from the E-Myth. They're very good at doing a specific function, and they end up becoming business managers because they can't let go. And that's why you find entrepreneurs end up being run by their businesses, not the other way around. So your goal should be to be a business owner and have a business that runs without you, so that you don't need to make the small decisions and you're not in the middle of the information flow as opposed to outside of it. So those would be a few concepts to keep in mind as you're trying to make that migration from full-time employee who's too tired to do things at night to someone who creates time and is able to use it in the way that they deem most exciting or fulfilling.
Right. So just to summarize, so I have this straight and everyone else has it straight. It would be the 80-20 rule. So you're eliminating tasks that don't provide much output for you in your work environment, and then slowly negotiating a means to work remotely and demonstrating that despite the fact that you do work remotely, you actually produce the same or even more output for the company you're working for. And then that frees up some time to start creating some of these muses you're talking about in order to get some cash flow happening, and then slowly reduce your dependency on your full-time employment check for your livelihood. That in a nutshell?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, that would be one approach. Just some other options that I want to put out on the table for people to consider is most employees, particularly good performers with valued skill sets, underestimate their leverage. So another very simple option would be to say, okay, I'm not going to check email. This is something you would basically propose to your boss. You say, okay, look, I want a 30% pay increase, and I'm not going to answer any email at night or on the evenings, and I want to spend Fridays at home at a home office. And if you're in a position where providing that would be less painful than firing you, 9 times out of 10, there's a way you can frame it so that you get that. So I just want to throw that out there, because there was a gentleman recently who was an attendee when I spoke at the Web 2.0 conference in San Francisco, where Jeff Bezos and Eric Schmidt were speaking, and he said, "Okay, well, I'm going to try this, but if I get fired, I'm going to blame you." I said, "Oh, that's fine,
Nice.
give it a shot." And I told him to ask for more than he expected to get, and he sat down. He sent me an email about a week later, and he sat down with his boss, and this is amazing because he went way beyond where I would have gone. But he asked for 3 days at home per week. He asked for a pay increase. He asked to be judged on performance instead of presence. So his billable hours were converted into completed projects. And he asked for a whole laundry list of about 10 things. And then at the end of his email, he said, miraculously, they agreed to all of it. So don't underestimate your leverage. It's a huge pain in the ass and very expensive and time consuming to replace good employees.
Yeah, you never know until you try. It's amazing what can happen. I know there's probably plenty of stories of the reverse where people have had a lot of trouble with their employers who are just, maybe they're not in a very senior position, so they don't have much leverage because of the type of work they do. Given that circumstance, what's the best advice? Like if you're clearly facing too much opposition from your employer to get that sort of circumstance, is it a case of, well, you actually start looking for a different type of employment situation, or actually quit your job? What's the advice?
Oh yeah, I mean, honestly, elimination is often a much better solution to fixing a seemingly irreparable situation. So for anyone who's ever been fired or laid off, they realize pretty quickly that it's usually not the nightmare world is over scenario that people who haven't been fired or laid off believe it to be. And quitting isn't either. So I have a chapter in the book called Killing Your Job, because some people want to know, like, okay, well, I have this boss, he yells at me, he gave me a BlackBerry, he calls me on Saturday evenings, and this, and this, I can't do anything, what should I do? And I say, quit your job. What the hell are you doing taking that kind of abuse? I mean, honestly, most people who are listening to this call are not in a third world country where they're not going to have health care to provide for them if they take a 2 or 3 week hiatus in between jobs to find a new one. So, I mean, there are cases where that's the best option. And even in lower end positions, it is very expensive to replace and train new people. So you have to present it in the right fashion, though. I mean, you need to present things like remote work as a business advantage, a business solution, as opposed to a personal perk. So you wouldn't say, I hate my commute and my Bob, the coworker, cubicle invader drives me nuts, so I want to work at home 2 days a week. That's a personal perk. You would need to say instead, number one, take a step back and assess exactly how your performance is measured and what your contribution to the profit loss is, if you have one. And you could say, okay, I actually spent last Saturday working because my family was out of town or what have you, And I was able to produce twice as many billable hours in 75% of the time. And that was without any type of confirmation or back and forth email with you or persons A, B, and C. So it saved me time, increased company profit. It also prevented the type of back and forth time consuming communication that happens when I have IM interrupting me and phone calls interrupting me every 3 minutes in the office. And that really surprised me. So, it saves me time, saves you time, and it actually will help us reach our new quarterly income goals. Would it be possible to take, let's say, Thursday and try that one day, just a one-time experiment this week or next week, and see what happens? And when you propose it in that way, it's very hard for someone to just say no. And you need to learn how to ask good questions. You don't say, can I do this? You say, I'd love to test this just once. Is that reasonable? And it's very precise when you ask these types of questions. And in the book, one thing you might remember I talk about is always assuming the person's going to say no, and having a contingency plan and, a fallback offer, as well as 3 to 6 responses to the expected objections, because they're going to come. So when you start with that and you walk into a presentation, a proposal prepared, you'll usually come out with an improved situation. Very rarely will they just reject it out of hand if you present it in the right way. And if they do, guess what? You just need a new boss.
Right. So it's all about framing the question. So it's what's in it for them and not what's in it for you so much.
Right.
I think you just covered pretty much the core advice. That obviously there's a lot more to it, but really that's the core advice for people who want to start moving towards a 4-hour work week. You probably had a lot of interaction with a lot of people who are trying to replicate what you're teaching there. Do you find that the biggest stumbling block for most of these people is the mindset or a sense of fear than anything else? Because if you give them the tools, which you clearly do, and there's a lot of people who then don't follow through with the tools, what is the stumbling block, the roadblock?
I think the roadblock is fear, but it's not just fear, it's ambiguous fear. And this is why I spent so much time on this when I was first counseling students, and then also my friends who've gone through some very interesting careers. And, I have friends who sell companies for like $480 million, $850 million, and the existential questions don't go away. What I mean by that is money doesn't solve most of the problems, the bigger questions that people have. So retirement's out. It's not a solution. And when you step back and you ask yourself, what's preventing me from designing the lifestyle that I want now, as opposed to 30, 40 years from now, you usually come up with a number of things. And it's very important. Just like goal setting to be effective needs to be very, very precise and measurable, what I call fear setting is analogous to that, but applied to fears. So as soon as you define fears very, very clearly, and I'll give a personal example, you tend to be able to overcome them. And so in my particular case, I reached threshold in mid-June 2004. I was working 90-hour weeks, and I realized it was unsustainable. I had gone through 3 very good relationships and destroyed all of them because I was too consumed by my business. And yeah, big bummer. And, it was a real wake-up call for me, because I realized that my life and the business couldn't coexist at that point. And I took a step back, and I decided that I wanted to take a trip to London to decompress, pull myself out of that environment, that speed-addicted environment, and really reassess how I could either redesign my business or shut it down. Before I took that trip to London, because it was going to be a 4-week trip, I was just like, oh my God, it'll never work. I can't leave. I check email 200 times a day. How am I going to take a trip to London? What am I going to do about this? What am I going to do about my apartment? What am I going to do with all my furniture? And there's just excuse to put it off. And what it came down to was I had a fear of the unknown. So when I actually sat down one day in what was the epitome of my, don't happy, be worry phase, I sat down and I was like, what's the worst thing that could absolutely happen? And I was like, okay, so I leave, someone breaks into my apartment, steals some of my furniture. Okay, fine. Someone steals my identity and I lose what's in, let's say, one of my bank accounts. Okay, fine. I'm traveling abroad and I come to the conclusion that my business can't coexist with my life and I shut down the business. Okay, fine. And when I looked at what are the worst things that could happen? And if all of those things happen, what would I do to recover? That's the most important second part. So what are the steps I could take to recover? What would I do? Like, let's say that I'm not projecting in the future, but let's say all these things just happened yesterday. What would I do today? And as soon as I started asking those questions, I realized that the, oh my God, my life is over scenario really wasn't that bad. It was actually quite easy to recover from. And it would take a little bit of effort and time to get back to baseline if that's what I wanted. But I already had the experience. I knew how to resume my current path later if that's what I decided to do. And I've seen that again and again where, for example, I have a friend, investment banker, another friend who's a lawyer, and they both were like, oh my God, it's going to look terrible on my resume. If I have a gap, it's going to be a disaster, because they wanted to try their own businesses. And they both tried their own businesses, and both of them ended up succeeding. But what was funny is even a year and a half later, they were still getting job offers in both of those industries, and they could pick up exactly where they left off, even with that resume gap. Most people don't realize that. The resume is for you. It's not for somebody else. So really defining fears very clearly. What's the worst thing that could happen if I considered doing X, and how would I recover it? How could I get back to where I am now if that were to come to pass? That's why one thing that I felt was so critical about making the book accessible to people is really expanding their comfortable sphere of action in small baby steps. So you have these comfort exercises that I propose people to take advantage of. And even at my Princeton classes, isn't something I talk about much, but I issue a challenge at the end of each class for the last few years where I basically say, look, I know all of you listen to this and you might think some of it's interesting, but almost all of you are going to walk out and do exactly the opposite. So here's what I'm proposing. Take one principle and apply it in this way, or, try to get a hold of 3 celebrities who are impossible to reach and get them to answer a question you want them to answer. And whoever does this in the most impressive fashion gets a free trip around the world, anywhere they want. And 2 things are amazing. The first is everyone says, oh my God, sign me up. I want to compete. And then out of a class of about 60 people, 3 people will actually do it. That's the first, because they expect that everyone else is going to do it. They overestimate the competition and underestimate themselves and end up completely shooting themselves in the foot. So about 3 people of 60 will try it. And then of those 3 people, just to give you an example, last year they were able to get in touch with people like George Bush Sr., the CEO of HP, Comcast, Goldman Sachs. The list goes on and on and on and on and on, just because they're willing to try it. So really being willing to test and then evaluate the worst case scenario realistically and coping to recover. That would be a long answer to a short question, but yes.
No, it's good stuff, Tim.
Ambiguous fear is a very bad thing, and it's inactionable. But as soon as you define it, you can overcome it.
Yeah, and I can see you're quite passionate about helping people do that, which leads me to my next question is, when did you sit down first initially and decide you wanted to write this and help people with this area of their lives? And what's, your grand purpose with all of this? What's in it for Tim, and what's in it with, the bigger picture?
Well, there are a few things. I've always enjoyed writing, and I've studied with some good writers, but never planned on writing a book. I actually find it very hard to write. I find it very difficult to write. I was in Argentina preparing for the World Championships in Tango, and I did my lecture at Princeton remotely via phone. And I had just tons of follow-up email because it was the first class where I really talked about my concept of lifestyle design as a replacement for long-haul career planning. And I really dove into a lot of the principles and ideas that I now teach there every semester. There were tons of questions. And then one student, because I wrote back to him and I said, man, I have about 30 pages of email responses I've already written. Seems like I really hit a nerve here. And he wrote back and he was like, yeah, well, maybe you should just put it all into a book and be done with it. Ha, ha, ha. And I think that's how a lot of businesses start. It's like, oh, that'd be really funny if, ha, ha, ha. And then the idea just doesn't go away. So that's how the book started. It just wouldn't go away. The idea was keeping me up at night. So I put together a proposal, did my homework, sent it to Jack Canfield, who I recruited as a mentor of mine, 5-6.
How did you do that, by the way?
Okay, I'll tell that in 1 second. So okay. I sent him the proposal and basically said, Jack, am I completely full of crap, or is there something here? And then he said, no, I think you have something here. And he made the necessary introductions for me to get an A-list agent, and then we sold the book. It's very easy to sell a book if you get an A-list agent behind you. So I'll answer the grand plan, and then I'll tell you how I got Jack.
Okay.
Grand plan for me is to have a huge disruptive effect with the book, meaning that it catalyzes an enormous backlash against an overwork culture that I think is just out of control. Because, more hours does not mean more productive, and, more connectivity does not mean happier or more successful. I think things are really out of control. The average work week is now 70 hours. Forbes reported that recently. And it's just going to get worse. It's going to get a lot worse unless people take some very dramatic and uncommon steps. So that's the bigger picture. I want this book to be a manifesto for people. I really want it to be a movement.
Okay, but taking that a step further then, given that disruptive effect happens and obviously people reduce the amount of work they're doing, presumably they're getting happier as a result.
Right.
That's obviously a big goal out of it. Do you think that would result in a cultural shift in some way that may have an even greater effect than necessarily on a micro level?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it will help take the concept of a results-only work environment, which has already been implemented by companies like Best Buy and in some cases like Netflix, where you can work whenever and wherever you want as long as you hit certain performance goals. I think that it can help get that to the tipping point where companies will have to adopt that to compete against each other. So, I've spoken at Google, I've spoken at PayPal, I've been invited to speak at some of these innovative companies here in Silicon Valley because of that. And I see this having a much greater effect than just on an individual personal level. I think it can have a huge institutional effect as well, and even a governmental effect. I won't even get into that, but as far as mandatory unpaid vacation days and things like that, I have very grand plans for this, but one step at a time. So as far as what's in it for me, there's a lot in it for me, but just seeing the ideas implemented and recognized in some cases for, I think the value that they offer is huge for me, because I've seen it on a micro scale in the Princeton class, and I wanted to magnify that effect on a huge national, international scale, and I think I can do that. So as far as how I got Jack, I'll keep it short, just because I know I don't have too much time left. But I volunteered with a not-for-profit group called the Silicon Valley Association of Startup Entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley. So it's a not-for-profit that focuses on fostering entrepreneurship, and they always have very good entrepreneurs, titans of entrepreneurship and CEOs, et cetera, speaking at their events. And a very good way to meet these people is to volunteer with one of these not-for-profits. I volunteered to actually produce an event, so to be the program chair essentially for a big event that I was going to focus on entrepreneurs who had created, multi-million-dollar, in some cases multi-billion-dollar companies with no outside financing. And it was my job to recruit all the speakers. So I had the credibility of this not-for-profit behind me, and I went out and I got people like the founder of Electronic Arts, the inventor of the Chia Pet, if that means anything to you guys over there.
Sadly enough, it does to me.
Okay, great. No, the guy's brilliant though, and really a brilliant distribution guy, a guy named Ed Bird, who was the first person to bring creatine monohydrate to market, the most popular sports supplement of all time. And then one of the other speakers I wanted to get was Jack Canfield. And it was very hard for me to get a hold of him because he gets bothered by everybody. So I bought a plane ticket, flew down to LA to go to Book Expo, which is the largest book trade show in the world, probably in the country, at least in the US. And I basically stalked him. I just waited in a room where I knew he was going to be speaking until he showed up, and walked up, stood right in the aisle in front of him and stopped him. And I said, Jack, if you don't know me, my name's Tim Ferriss. I'm working for a really well-known entrepreneurial not-for-profit in Silicon Valley. I would really like you to speak at our event. There are going to be a lot of incredible people there I'd like to introduce you to who are also at the same level as yourself. I'm not sure if you'd be interested, but I want to do this with you. And he said, okay. He really didn't know what to say because I just kind of jumped out of a chair to pop up in front of him. And he gave me a business card, and he's like, all right, send me an email. And 10 emails, 20 emails, 30 emails later, I got him to come down and speak at this event, which was very hard to do because his usual speaking fees are like 30 to 50 grand plus. It's not easy. Mm-hmm. In any case, I got him to come down and speak, and we became friends, and we just kept in touch. So I really engaged in a conversation with him, and I was interested in what he'd done. I didn't pitch him anything. I didn't have any help. I wasn't asking for any help, but I ended up being interviewed for his book, The Success Principles. So I'm in that book. And then I was also interviewed for his more recent book, You Got to Read This Book, which is, about the books that have changed people's lives. Yeah. So I have a chapter in there. So finally, when I decided to do my own book, it was just a natural fit. So I knew him for 5 years or so before I ever asked him for anything. just keeping in touch, once every 6 months, every 8 months, 9 months, and just kind of following each other and what we were doing. So that's how it happened.
Right. You had a relationship. Yeah, that's fantastic.
And it's very similar to how I approached this book. I had relationships with a lot of the bloggers you've seen talking about the book. It was very similar. I made the effort to get to know these people because I found them interesting and I was interested in what they were doing, months before the book ever came out. And, it's funny because I get these emails and phone calls like, what's the best way to pitch bloggers? And I'm like, I'm not sure. You find people you're interested in, you think have a lot of shared DNA, who would find your book of value. And then you offer it with absolutely no expectations and send it to them and hope for the best.
You don't pitch, really?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Okay, well, we're almost at that point where we got to end this call. So I'm going to end with, it's getting like to be a famous question now. For the people listening to this call who are right at the beginning, who haven't really started any of this process of going towards either starting a business or reducing the amount of work they do at their employment, what would be your number one piece of advice to help these guys just start the momentum happening?
Sure. Okay. So the number one piece of advice is sit down and define in quantitative terms exactly what you need to experience your ideal lifestyle in the here and now and not in the deferred life plan of retirement. So sit down, and there are actually worksheets and calculators and everything that you can use for this on my website. It doesn't cost anything. Just go to 4hourworkweek.com. You can spell it however you want. I have 100 URLs for it. So 4hourworkweek.com, and you create essentially a spreadsheet of, this is my ideal lifestyle. These are all the things I dream of doing in retirement. And then you calculate the average monthly cost. And when you do that, what's amazing is you realize that it is often much more inexpensive than you think. And all of a sudden, the idea of spending the most capable years of your life doing something that is anything less than extremely exciting becomes absolutely repulsive. And that's the type of system shock, the type of pattern interrupt that most people need to get them to take the first few steps. So really defining what your target monthly income is and your ideal lifestyle is, that would be my recommendation.